57 bodies pulled from the mangled steel of the wreckage. 57 lives clinging to a desperate thread in the mud, miles away from any emergency room. When the hospital director demanded the name of the rogue hero who kept them all breathing, the silence in the boardroom was absolute, until someone finally whispered the truth. The suspension was handed down on a Tuesday, beneath the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the administrative wing at Mercy Creek Medical Center. Dr. Preston Vale, the newly appointed director of emergency medicine, did not look up from his pristine, color-coded spreadsheet as he slid the disciplinary form across the mahogany desk. He was a man who worshipped liability metrics and budget margins, viewing patients less as human beings and more as potential lawsuits waiting to hatch. "You circumvented a direct chain of command, Nurse Marlow," Vale said, his voice as sterile as an operating theater. Sienna Marlow stood her ground. At 34, she had spent 12 grueling years in the trauma bay. She knew the smell of metallic blood, the rhythm of failing hearts, and the exact shade of pale a human face turned right before the soul gave out. She also knew that the boy she had saved, a 7-year-old named Milo Fenwick, would be dead if she'd followed Vale's beloved protocols. Dr. Foster froze, Sienna stated, her voice remarkably steady, despite the fury vibrating in her chest. The patient was in severe anaphylactic shock. His airway was closing. Dr. Foster was waiting for a toxicology panel that was going to take 45 minutes. Milo didn't have 45 minutes. He had 3. "I pushed the epinephrine. I saved his life. You are a nurse," Vale snapped, finally looking up, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "You do not diagnose. You do not prescribe. And you certainly do not push Schedule 1 or high-risk medications without a physician's explicit verbal and written authorization. It is a violation of hospital policy, state board regulations, and my direct orders." "He was turning blue, Preston," Sienna argued, dropping the formalities. "Dr. Vale," he corrected sharply. "And frankly, Sienna, your cowboy mentality is exactly what this hospital no longer tolerates. The board wants Mercy Creek to be a center of excellence, not the Wild West. You are suspended for 30 days without pay, effective immediately, pending a full board review, which will likely result in your termination." Adele Winslow, the veteran head nurse who had mentored Sienna for a decade, stood in the corner of the office, her jaw tight, but she was powerless against Vale's new regime. "Hand over your badge," Vale demanded. Sienna unclipped the plastic ID from her scrubs. It felt heavier than it should have. She placed it on his desk, right over his meticulously organized spreadsheets. "When the day comes that your spreadsheets can stop a hemorrhage, Dr. Vale, let me know." She walked out of the hospital that afternoon into a suffocatingly humid July air, feeling a profound sense of loss. Nursing wasn't just a job for Sienna, it was the only way she knew how to make the world make sense. Stripped of her title, she felt like a ghost haunting the streets of the city. By Friday evening, the suspension had festered into a deep, restless ache. Sienna was sitting in a worn leather booth at Miller's Diner on the outskirts of town, nursing her 4th cup of black coffee. The diner sat near the edge of the sprawling industrial valley, overlooked by the towering structural arch of the old Northern Pacific Railway bridge. She was staring blankly at the rain lashing against the diner's neon-lit windows when the world tore itself apart. It didn't sound like a crash. It sounded like the sky ripping open. A deafening metallic shriek echoed through the valley, followed by a concussive boom that shattered the diner's front windows, sending a shower of safety glass over the linoleum floor. The ground heaved violently, knocking Sienna out of her booth. Outside, through the pouring rain and the sudden, terrifying darkness caused by failing power grids, a nightmare unfolded. The 8:15 commuter express, packed with Friday evening travelers returning from the city, had derailed. The aging trestle bridge, weakened by days of torrential rain and a suspected structural fault, had given way. 5 massive passenger cars had plunged into the steep, rocky ravine below, slamming into the perimeter of an abandoned chemical processing plant. Sienna didn't think. The instincts honed over a decade in the trauma bay overrode her shock. She scrambled over the shattered glass of the diner, ignoring the cuts on her palms, and sprinted toward the ravine. The sight that met her at the edge of the cliff was apocalyptic. Twisted steel groaned under the weight of the rain. Small electrical fires hissed as they met the mud, and rising from the darkness below was a sound that would haunt Sienna for the rest of her life. The collective, agonizing wail of dozens of people trapped in the dark. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Sienna knew the geography of this town perfectly. The ravine was entirely inaccessible by road. The only access point, the old service bridge, had been crushed by the train's locomotive. It would take the fire department and paramedics at least an hour to clear the debris and rappel down with heavy gear. An hour in a mass casualty event was a death sentence. Sienna slid down the treacherous, muddy embankment, her clothes instantly soaked, her hands scraping against sharp rocks and jagged roots. When she hit the bottom, the smell of diesel fuel and raw copper filled her lungs. She was entirely alone in the dark with what looked like a war zone. She had no badge, no hospital backing, no sterilized trauma bay, and no doctors to give her orders. She only had her hands, her mind, and a ticking clock. The first survivor Sienna found was a man pinned beneath a sheared metal seat. His name, mumbled through blood-stained lips, was Theo. His leg was crushed, but that wasn't what was killing him. He was gasping for air, his chest rising asymmetrically. Tension pneumothorax, Sienna's brain registered instantly. His lung had collapsed and trapped air was crushing his heart. In a hospital, she would hand a doctor a sterile 14-gauge needle to decompress the chest. Here, she had nothing. "Hold on, Theo. Look at me. Keep looking at my eyes," Sienna commanded, her voice slicing through his panic with absolute authority. She desperately patted down his pockets, finding a thick, hollow plastic pen. She ripped it apart with her teeth, spitting out the ink cartridge. It wasn't sterile. It was reckless. Dr. Vale would have had a stroke just witnessing it, but Theo's eyes were rolling back. His pulse was fading. Sienna found his second intercostal space, wiped the mud away with her sleeve, and drove the hollow plastic barrel of the pen into his chest. A hiss of escaping air followed, and Theo immediately drew a ragged, massive breath, his color slowly returning in the dim light of Sienna's cell phone flashlight. "You're going to live," she told him, tearing a strip from his shirt to secure the makeshift tube, "but I have to keep moving." Within 15 minutes, Sienna had dragged 6 people from the most dangerous part of the wreckage. She realized quickly that she couldn't just treat people randomly. She needed a system, a casualty collection point. She spotted a structurally sound concrete loading dock attached to the abandoned chemical plant, slightly elevated from the mud and protected from the freezing rain by a corrugated steel overhang. "Hey!" Sienna shouted to a dazed young man in a torn suit who was wandering aimlessly. "You! What's your name?" "Dean," he stammered. "Dean, I need you to focus. I am a trauma nurse. You are going to help me save these people. Grab that piece of siding. We're using it as a backboard. We are moving everyone to that concrete dock. Go." Her absolute command galvanized the uninjured and the walking wounded. Under Sienna's direction, they began a grim assembly line. She stripped the dead of their belts, using them as crude tourniquets for the living. She used torn luggage straps to splint shattered femurs. She designated a teenage girl to sit with the head trauma patients and keep them awake by asking them their birthdays on a loop. Patient by patient, she triaged. Green, walking wounded, sent to the back to organize supplies found in suitcases, clean shirts for bandages, alcohol from mini bottles for crude sterilization. Yellow, stable but immobile. Red, critical. Black, deceased. She had to force herself to walk past the ones who couldn't be saved, a brutal emotional toll that required an iron will. By the time the first distant beams of the fire department's heavy rescue trucks illuminated the top of the ravine, Sienna had 57 living patients neatly organized on the concrete dock. 57 people who had been bleeding out, suffocating, or going into shock. She was covered head to toe in blood, grease, and mud, moving like a machine, checking pulses, loosening and tightening tourniquets to save limbs, packing deep lacerations with ripped cotton. Up at Mercy Creek Medical Center, chaos of a different breed was reigning. Dr. Preston Vale stood in the center of the emergency department, shouting orders at a panicked staff. He had activated the hospital's MCI protocol. The media vans were already parked outside, and Vale was acutely aware of the cameras. He had prepared a speech about Mercy Creek's state-of-the-art readiness, but as the minutes ticked into hours, a strange confusion settled over the ER. "Where are they?" Vale barked at Dr. Palmer, the senior ER attending. "The fire chief said there were over 80 passengers on that train. We've received 12 walking wounded. Where are the criticals?" Palmer, holding a two-way radio connected to EMS dispatch, looked baffled. "Dr. Vale, dispatch is reporting that the heavy rescue teams just reached the bottom of the ravine, but they're saying triage is already done." "Done?" Vale's brow furrowed. "What do you mean done? By who? Did County General send a helicopter down there?" "No, sir. Paramedic Unit 4 is on the radio now. They said they found a massive casualty collection point at the base of the ravine. 57 critical and severe patients," they said. Palmer paused, listening to the static-filled radio. "They said someone is already down there holding the line. Chest tubes improvised from pens. Arterial bleeds clamped with hairpins and shoelaces. Hypovolemic shock being managed by elevating legs and body heat sharing." Vale stared at him. "That's impossible. You can't run an advanced triage of that scale in the dark, in the mud, without a physician. Who is down there? Which one of our doctors broke protocol and deployed without my authorization?" "Dispatch says they don't know, sir. The paramedics are just loading the patients onto the basket winches. But whoever did it, the paramedics are saying they've never seen anything like it. They're saying this person single-handedly kept 57 people from bleeding out before help arrived." Vale felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. The mayor was already en route to the hospital. The board of directors was watching. If Mercy Creek had a rogue doctor acting like a hero out there, Vale needed to control the narrative immediately. He needed to own this victory. "Find out who it is," Vale ordered Palmer, his voice tight. "Get me a name. The moment they arrive at this hospital, I want them in my office. We need to manage the press on this." Down in the ravine, the flashing red and blue lights finally breached the darkness. Heavily geared firefighters and paramedics swarmed the concrete dock. A seasoned paramedic named Holt dropped to his knees next to Sienna, who was holding pressure on a severed femoral artery with her bare, blood-slicked hands. She looked up at him, her face completely masked in dirt and dried blood, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "I've got it, Doc," Holt said, reaching out to take over the pressure point, assuming anyone with this level of medical control had to be a trauma surgeon. "We've got the medevac lines set up. You saved them. You saved all of them. What's your name, Doc?" Sienna slowly released the pressure to the paramedic. She wiped a bloody forearm across her forehead, her chest heaving, as the adrenaline that had sustained her for 3 hours finally began to crash. She looked at the 57 faces illuminated by the harsh portable floodlights. Theo with his plastic pen, Dean with his bloodied suit, children wrapped in dry coats. She didn't answer Holt. She didn't want the credit. She just wanted to wash her hands. Without a word, as the paramedics swarmed the patients and the noise of the rescue operation hit a crescendo, Sienna Marlow slipped backward into the shadows of the ravine, leaving nothing behind but 57 beating hearts. The double doors of Mercy Creek Medical Center's trauma bay blasted open, shattering the tense, sterile silence that Dr. Preston Vale had so painstakingly cultivated. A flood of mud, rainwater, and chaos poured onto the pristine white linoleum as the first wave of stretchers rolled in. The wailing of ambulance sirens echoed against the concrete loading docks, a stark contrast to the quiet spreadsheets Vale had been reviewing just hours before. The catastrophic train derailment had brought the reality of visceral, uncontrollable trauma directly to his doorstep, and Vale felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Paramedic Holt pushed the first gurney through the doors, shouting vitals over the cacophony of shouting nurses and beeping monitors. Male, mid-40s, crush injury to the right lower extremity, but that's secondary. He suffered a tension pneumothorax in the field, decompressed prior to our arrival. Vitals are stabilizing. Blood pressure 90/60. Heart rate 110. Vale stepped forward, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. He looked down at the patient, a man named Theo, whose face was pale and streaked with dark, oily mud. But it wasn't the crush injury that made Vale freeze. It was the man's chest. Protruding from the second intercostal space, secured tightly with a torn, blood-soaked strip of a dress shirt, was the shattered plastic barrel of a ballpoint pen. Vale stared at it, his mind short-circuiting. The makeshift chest tube was crude, horrifyingly unsterile, and wildly against every protocol printed in the Mercy Creek handbook. Yet it was perfectly placed. The unmistakable hiss of trapped air escaping through the plastic barrel told Vale that this reckless, insane maneuver had unequivocally saved the man's life. "Who did this?" Vale demanded, looking up at Holt. "Which one of my trauma surgeons was down there? Was it Palmer? Did County General send a specialized field team? I need a name for the press briefing. The mayor is outside right now, and they want to know who the hero is." Holt shook his head, wiping sweat and rain from his brow. "It wasn't a surgeon, Dr. Vale, and it wasn't anyone from County General. When my team finally rappelled down into that ravine, it was a slaughterhouse. But the casualties were already sorted. Someone had set up a designated triage zone on an old concrete dock. 57 patients. Every single critical bleeder was clamped, packed, or tied off. Every airway was secured. It was like watching a ghost operation. A ghost operation? Vale snapped, his patience fraying. People do not just magically receive advanced trauma care in a lightless ravine. "Give me a name, Holt. Who was running the casualty collection point?" "I don't know," Holt replied, sounding just as bewildered. "She didn't stick around. She was a woman, maybe mid-30s, covered in mud and diesel fuel. No badge, no scrubs. She was wearing a torn jacket and jeans. The second we took over the pressure points, she just faded into the shadows and walked away. Didn't ask for a blanket, didn't ask for a radio, just vanished into the rain." Adele Winslow, the veteran head nurse, had been quietly directing the flow of incoming walking wounded. She paused, her hands trembling slightly, as she listened to Holt's description. She walked over to Theo's stretcher, looking closely at the specific, intricate knot used to tie the torn shirt around the plastic pen. It was a modified clove hitch, tied with a very specific double loop, a knot she had taught to exactly one person during a brutal mass casualty drill 5 years ago. "She didn't give you a name at all?" Vale pressed, his voice rising in frustration. "Someone down there must have heard something. We have 57 survivors, and you're telling me nobody knows who kept them alive for 3 hours?" A young man in a ruined, blood-stained suit limped into the trauma bay, leaning heavily on a paramedic. It was Dean. He looked exhausted, his eyes haunted by the horrors he had witnessed in the dark, but his mind was crystal clear. "She was the one in charge," Dean said, his voice raspy, but echoing loudly enough to cut through the noise of the emergency room. "I was wandering around in shock. She grabbed me by the shoulders. She had this look in her eyes like she wasn't scared of the dark or the blood. She told me she was a trauma nurse. She made me help her carry the wounded. She didn't hesitate, not even for a second." Vale's eyes narrowed. "A trauma nurse? From where? Did she say where she worked?" Theo, lying on the stretcher, turned his head weakly toward Vale. "She kept talking to me," he whispered, his breath shallow but steady. "When she shoved that pen into my chest, I thought I was dying. She told me to look at her eyes. She said her name was Sienna. She told me she wasn't going to let me die in the mud." The name dropped into the frantic emergency room like a lead weight. For a moment, the beeping of the cardiac monitors seemed to fade into the background. Adele Winslow closed her eyes, a fierce, undeniable surge of pride swelling in her chest. She looked at Vale, watching as the blood drained entirely from his meticulously groomed face. "Sienna," Adele repeated, her voice dripping with cold, sharp clarity. "A trauma nurse named Sienna, mid-30s, capable of running a mass casualty triage in her sleep, capable of improvising a chest tube because she knows the anatomy better than half the residents in this hospital." "No," Vale whispered, taking a step back, shaking his head. "No, that is impossible. That is a coincidence." "She doesn't have the authority." "She didn't need your authority, Preston," Adele snapped, dropping the professional titles. "She used a plastic pen because she didn't have your pristine medical supply closet. She saved 57 people using the exact same instincts you fired her for yesterday afternoon. Sienna Marlow is the one who saved them." Vale felt the walls closing in. The implications were catastrophic for his career. He had suspended a nurse for saving one life against protocol, only for that same nurse to single-handedly save 57 lives using completely unauthorized, deeply rogue methods. If the press found out that Mercy Creek's new director had actively punished and banished the hero of the Valley derailment just 24 hours prior, the public outcry would destroy him. The hospital board would have his head on a platter. Nobody speaks to the press, Vale ordered, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and rage. Not a word about Sienna Marlow. We control this narrative. The hospital's training and protocols saved these people. Am I understood? But Adele just stared at him, a hardened glint in her eyes. You can't control the truth, doctor. Not when 57 people are alive to tell it. The morning sun broke through the heavy storm clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the front steps of Mercy Creek Medical Center. A sea of news vans, reporters, and flashing cameras had assembled on the damp pavement. The entire state was tuning in to hear the miraculous story of the Valley derailment. 57 critical survivors, 0 fatalities among those who made it to the triage point. It was a medical miracle, and Dr. Preston Vale was determined to stand at the absolute center of it. Vale adjusted his designer tie, plastering on a somber, deeply authoritative expression as he stepped up to the podium alongside Mayor Rutherford. He looked out at the flashing cameras, ignoring the sinking feeling of dread in his stomach. He had spent the entire night threatening his staff, ensuring that the name Sienna Marlow was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic jargon and hospital PR spin. Ladies and gentlemen, Vale began, his voice projecting smoothly over the microphones. Last night, our community faced an unimaginable tragedy, but through the darkness, the relentless dedication, superior protocols, and rigorous emergency training of Mercy Creek Medical Center shone through. Our systemic readiness is what allowed us to coordinate the survival of 57 critical patients. I am immensely proud of the system we have built here. Reporter Diane from Channel 7 raised her hand, shouting over the crowd. Dr. Vale, the paramedics on the scene reported that a lone medical professional stabilized the victims hours before rescue teams could access the ravine. Can you confirm the identity of this Mercy Creek doctor? Vale offered a practiced, humble smile. In a crisis, we function as a faceless, unified team. The initial stabilization was a result of our overarching community medical guidelines. We don't focus on rogue individuals. We focus on the institutional excellence of Mercy Creek. Institutional excellence? A voice echoed from the hospital entrance. The cameras immediately swiveled. The reporters parted. Rolling down the ADA ramp was Theo, sitting in a hospital-issued wheelchair, an IV line still taped to the back of his hand. Pushing the wheelchair was Dean, wearing a borrowed hospital scrub top, his face bruised and battered. Flanking them both was head nurse Adele Winslow, her face set in stone. Vale's heart stopped. Security, he hissed under his breath. Get them back inside. They are patients. This is a HISPA violation. But the press was already surging forward, microphones extended. Institutional excellence didn't save my life, Theo said, his voice surprisingly strong, carrying over the stunned silence of the reporters. He pulled slightly at his hospital gown, revealing the heavy bandages covering his right chest. A woman in the freezing mud saved my life. She didn't have protocols. She didn't have a hospital. She ripped a pen apart with her teeth and shoved it into my lungs so I wouldn't suffocate in the dark. Dean stepped forward, glaring directly at Vale. She ran the entire ravine. She ordered us, she organized us, and she kept us alive while your hospital was safely sitting miles away. She said she was a trauma nurse. Diane thrust her microphone toward Adele. Nurse Winslow, do you know who this woman is? Does she work for Mercy Creek? Adele stepped up to the podium, completely ignoring Vale's frantic, desperate gestures to cut the feed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the plastic ID badge that Sienna had surrendered 2 days prior. She held it up to the cameras. Her name is Sienna Marlow, Adele declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable truth. She was the finest trauma nurse this hospital ever had. But she wasn't representing Mercy Creek last night. She couldn't have been, because on Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Preston Vale suspended her and threatened her with termination for breaking protocol to save a dying child. A collective gasp ripped through the press corps. The flashing of cameras intensified into a blinding strobe. Mayor Rutherford turned to Vale, his face purple with outrage. "You suspended the woman who saved all 57 victims?" the mayor demanded, his microphone picking up the furious whisper. She is a liability." Vale stammered, his polished facade shattering into pieces on live television. "She operates outside the boundaries of modern medicine. She is dangerous." "She is a hero!" Theo shouted back. "And you are a coward." Miles away, in a small, quiet apartment, Sienna Marlow sat wrapped in a thick fleece blanket, nursing a mug of tea. Her hands were heavily bandaged, her muscles screaming in agony from the physical toll of the night before. She stared at her small television screen, watching the chaotic collapse of Dr. Preston Vale's career unfold in real time. She didn't feel a sense of triumphant joy. She only felt a profound, quiet relief. The patients were alive. Milo Fenwick was alive. Theo was alive. Dean was alive. That was the only metric that had ever mattered to her. Her cell phone, sitting on the coffee table, suddenly buzzed. The caller ID displayed the name of the chief of medicine at State University Trauma Center, the most prestigious high-volume emergency hospital in the region, located 3 cities over. Sienna took a slow sip of her tea, the ghost of a smile finally touching her lips. She picked up the phone. Her days of fighting broken spreadsheets were over. It was time to get back to saving lives. If Sienna's incredible bravery inspired you, don't let her story fade into the background. True heroes rarely wear capes, they wear scrubs, working tirelessly while battling broken systems. Hit that like button to honor frontline workers. Share this video with someone who'd appreciate Sienna's unforgettable journey, and subscribe to Beyond the Silence Tales for more gripping, real-life stories of ordinary people doing the extraordinary.
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. "Who saved all 57 victims?" the director demanded. "The nurse you suspended," they answered. "I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel?" What stayed with me most was the reminder that kindness, professionalism, and quiet dedication can make a difference, even when they go unnoticed. Moments like these encourage us to look beyond first impressions and remember that people's actions often speak louder than opinions. Have you ever seen someone prove others wrong through their actions instead of their words? What part of this story stood out to you the most? If this message meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that spark meaningful conversations, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.